Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the path between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host, Andrew Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. Hey there, welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our patron chat on the Poetic Edda. But first, I want to go ahead and thank all of my patrons that make this kind of thing possible, as well as all the other various things that I do independently and the things that we collaborate on as the Fellowship. Right now, we are just on the verge of having 50 paid patrons, which is incredible. We're at 47 at the time of this recording, and so hopefully we can push that over the edge by next time. You just head on over to patreon.com/mythicmind and go ahead and sign on. Any level of support really helps me to continue doing more of this sort of thing. My goal long term is to be fully funded independently so I can really just pour time into creating the best possible fellowship I can create and creating the best quality and quantity of content that I can. And so go to patreon.com/mythicmind. Any level of support helps. It gives you full access to the Discord and lets you participate in things like this. And I want to highlight some of the really cool things that are coming up this year. If you purchase an annual Tier 3 membership, then I'm going to give you full access to the courses that are currently on the books. And so coming up, that's a brief history of ideas, which is kind of like intro to philosophy, but it's going to be better than, as somebody who's taught intro to philosophy a number of times, I can tell you it's going to be better than the vast majority of intro to philosophy university courses, and it's only covering 6 weeks. I include all of the PDFs for the readings. I'll recommend probably some other translations and some hard copies that you should get, but I'm not going to mandate that you buy any text. And so some version of the text that we'll be reading will be available through the Google Classroom, the platform that I'm using now. And so that's a brief history of ideas. That's the next one that's coming up. And then following that, we're going to do Plato, Stoicism, Until We Have Faces. That's a study that I'm really excited about putting together. And then a little bit later, around September or so, we'll be doing the Elder Scrolls and philosophy, which is kind of cool that, I've mostly been doing a literary focus, but I think that there's some potential here for dealing with the questions of like, how do video games relate to literature as an art form? What are its advantages? What are its disadvantages? And then what are the philosophical and religious ideas that we see in the Elder Scrolls in particular? And how does that relate to kind of our primary world ideas? And so I think that there are a lot of different angles that we're going to use there, a lot of different lenses. I think it's going to be really an interesting study. And again, if you sign on with a Tier 3 annual patronage, then you will get access to all of that for one price. And furthermore, by becoming a patron of Mythic Mind at any level, you're going to get a discount on any courses that come from other Mythic Mind creators. And so right now, we've got Hannah Gilmore. She's putting together an introductory Latin course that's coming up in May. It looks really good. I've looked over what she's posted to her Google Classroom. I look forward to participating personally. And so if you want to get started with Latin, as well as to learn a little bit about Roman culture and history, then you should enroll in her course. And I'll leave a link to her Patreon in the show notes as well. But if you become a Mythic Mind patron at any level, you get half off that course. And so that could be a good way to go there if that interests you. And you also get half off of any other courses made by fellowship members that may be coming up this year. But for right now, I really want to thank all of my current patrons, and especially those who are at the Tier 3 or higher. And so many thanks to Mark, Chaz, Aaron, Clinton, Evie, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Mariah, Paul, Tyler, and William. And of course, thanks to all the other 35 paid patrons as well. If you're not already on board, then I welcome you to join the fellowship at patreon.com/mythicmind. And if you're not quite ready to throw a few dollars our way, then you can go ahead and become a free patron. And that will give you access to some occasional updates about some things we have going on, as well as some occasional invitations to participate on the show. I just recently sent out the first one of those that's available even to free patrons. And so that's patreon.com/mythicmind. And again, find that link in the show notes. But I should say that if you make any purchases through Patreon, whether you're buying a subscription or you buy an individual class, a product, make sure that you go through your browser and not the Patreon app, because when you go through the app, well, Apple upcharges. That way they can take a cut for themselves. So make sure that you're using your browser for any purchases on Patreon. All right. Well, now let's go ahead and get to this week's patron chat on the Eddic text. Welcome back as we continue with our edit chats with the next series of texts here, which mostly continue to deal with the Volsung saga and Sigurd and Sigmund and whatnot. Um, as a reminder to anyone who's listening or who is tuning in for the first time, we none of us are at all experts on these texts. I mean, we're all kind of interested in myths and fantasy and the things that these texts have inspired, but we're definitely just kind of amateurs going up the river here and seeing what we can find along the way. Um, but before we get into the text, I'd like to just check in with Thomas and Josh. I mean, do you guys have anything going on? Anything you want to plug? Any updates to provide for us? Thomas?
Yeah, so as of recording, this is still February, and earlier this month, my debut children's book finally came out from the great folks at Word on Fire Votive. So if you go to bookstore.wordonfire.com, you can see my new book, The Riddle of the Tungstones, how Blessed Nicholas Steno uncovered the hidden history of the Earth. It's children's nonfiction for ages about 8 through 14. And it's the story of Nicholas Steno, who was a pioneering geologist and also a Catholic priest and a very holy man. And I go through his whole story of literally laying the groundwork for the science of geology. And as of tomorrow, I'll be starting work on what I hope will be the follow-up book. So we'll see.
Good, that's fantastic. So what in particular led you here? I mean, no, obviously you've got your science background, but like what led you to that focus or to write about him?
Yeah, I've known about him for a long time. I took a lot of geology classes in my early years of college, and I he was always in the very early pages of every like geology textbook, and I was always fascinated by him because those textbooks always tended to downplay the fact that he had this whole other side of his life, that he was, a religious person and a clergyman. So I wanted to tell his story, and even among, Christians and people who are, interested in the whole science and faith, conversation. I feel like he's just not as well known. And he's someone who, if I was, if I had known about him when I was 10 years old, it would have really excited me because like he's essentially like the patron saint of paleontology. And so that would have really excited me as a kid. And my whole goal these days is to write the kind of books that would have excited me as a kid. So that's really what drew me to this. I want to write things that are gonna inspire, educate, and entertain young minds. And that's kind of what I'm all about right now. It's kind of my new mission, and I'm very excited about it.
Well, that's great. It's a very noble mission. Can you tell us anything about what you're working on next, or is that under wraps at this point?
It's not really under wraps because I have sort of soft pitched it to my editors, but nothing's official yet. Next, I would like to tell the story of Henri Breuil. He was a French priest and an archaeologist from the 20th century. He was involved in studying the famous painted caves at Lascaux in southern France. And if you look up cave paintings on the internet, they're the ones that come up. And it's also a very neat story that I think kids will be interested in because those caves were initially discovered by kids who were looking for their lost dog, who had turned out to find this hole in the ground that led to this whole cavern system and these cave paintings that nobody had ever seen before. So I've just done a lot of preliminary research about the caves at Lascaux and about Henri Breuil's life, and it's a really fascinating story. And I'm really excited to get down to this week to start drafting. So
That is
very
exciting, and it
excited.
is just
Yeah.
so crazy how we can still just like find things like this. Like,
Yeah.
we can think of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how the things get discovered by accident.
Yeah. Oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I may have to tackle that sometime because they have an
Yeah.
interesting story too. I just love archaeology and paleontology. So, and the thrill of discovery, that was always something that, I loved reading books about explorers and scientists when I was a kid, so that's really what I want to write about these days.
That's great, and it definitely sounds like you're doing your part to, re-enchant science by putting it in its proper
Yes.
context.
Yes, yeah, and to make a story out of it, as well. There, to like in our kind of hyper STEM culture, we focus on facts and figures and numbers and not enough on the whole narrative and thrill of discovery and that there were people behind these great discoveries and people with lives and with a faith in God. And I just think that, yeah, I like that idea, re-enchanting science. That's great.
Good, good. Uh, Josh, do you have anything going on?
Other than hoping that along with these discoveries that keep happening, that one day they discover Cthulhu at the bottom of the ocean. Other than that, no, not a whole lot. I mean, my Substack is still just consisting of weekly posts. Right now, they're pretty much just all on the Divine Comedy. So just doing one canto a week, basically doing three cantos from each basically each section of the comedy. So there'll be eventually be nine. I believe there's five out right now, just finishing up Purgatorio. So this is part of a graduate school program. But other than that, just working and preparing for my next child to be born. So try not to commit to anything else, basically.
Yeah, I'm not very good at that, not committing to things.
I
Uh,
know when my first daughter was born, I was like, you know what? I've slept like 3 hours a night the past 3 nights, and it would be a great time to start learning how to read the Bible in Greek. Because you know what? This is a normal thing that people do.
yeah, I got messed up by writing my dissertation while working and having our twins because at that point, just
It's
out of necessity, I learned how to just do stuff without sleeping. And then I never learned how to turn it off. So I just haven't really slept for years and I'm mostly okay with that. But I know that eventually it's going to hit me. um, but yeah, we've got our next is sometime within the next couple of weeks. And here I am planning out three more courses to lead and, all
Oh.
sorts of stuff. So, but it's fine. It'll be fine.
I
Um,
have been learning to sort of wake up automatically at 4 in the morning, so there's that. I don't have kids, but like I am learning to do without less sleep, but I'm sure like you say, it'll eventually bite me later.
yeah, I think of just that episode of Seinfeld where he's talking about how, Night Jerry or Morning Jerry hates Night Jerry. It's like that's how I feel odd times. Like I'm fine at nighttime. Morning's not always quite so thrilling. Uh, well, that's cool. Well, I guess we can go ahead and start to work through some of these texts, see what we're able to pull out here. Um, Now, the first one we're starting off on was the death of Sinfiotli, which doesn't really have a whole lot to it. It's just a short little prose about the
Mm.
death of Sinfiotli, who was the son of Sigmund of the Volsungs and Borghild, or it's Borghild's not biological, right? Yeah, because I'm trying to remember all this as I work it together. Sinfiotli was the son of Sigmund and actually his sister, if I recall correctly. Um, we get in the Volsung saga kind of a Children of Hurin situation going on.
Oh no.
Yeah, where there's some deception and it's it's kind of strange, but definitely the inspiration I think for Tolkien in that Children of Hurin situation. So yeah, so that's where Sinfiotli comes from. So stepchild of Borghild, who is now the wife of Sigmund, and Sinfiotli and I think it's like his uncle are both going after trying to woo this same woman, and Sinfiotli ends up killing the uncle. So then Borghild essentially poisons Sinfiotli. Yeah, so it's like Norse soap opera stuff here. I don't know. I really don't have anything insightful to pull from this. I don't know if you have any comments.
Was Sigmund the one who all of his brothers and him were pinned under a trunk of wood and devoured night by night by like one by one by the she wolf, and he was the only one that escaped?
Yes, that's correct. And he
Okay, I'm just trying to
escapes.
make sure I'm getting my names and orders mixed right
Yes,
here. Would it be really
because
profitable to read like some of the Volsung saga along with this and take notes? Regret that, so note for next time.
Yes, that would be helpful. And the Volsung saga is not terribly long. It is interesting.
No, yeah. I have
Yeah,
read that before. It was a while ago, but I remember I was starting to remember things going through some of these shorter Edda texts. I was like, "Oh yeah, that I remember that from the Volsung saga." Yeah, it's not long at all. So, yeah, if you
yeah,
want to read that as a companion, you
it'd be
probably
a good
can.
idea. I probably need to read through it again before next time. I read it, I don't know, several months ago at this point, in the midst of my Beowulf studies, kind of as a side note. I went off and read the Volsung saga, but I mean, all the specific details haven't exactly stayed in my head here. Um, but yeah, and so Sigmund's wife, Borghild, poisoned Sinfiotli. But at first, Sinfiotli kind of recognizes something's amiss, and so he goes and tells his father Sigmund that my drink is kind of cloudy. And then Sigmund, because he's like this uber warrior kind of guy, he just drinks it because poison can't hurt him. And this happens like repeatedly, where Borghild keeps giving Sinfiotli this poison drink that then Sigmund keeps drinking until finally for whatever reason, I guess he's worn down. Sinfiotli decides to finally just drink it, and he dies. Um, yeah, I don't really have any great insight to pull from this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm content just moving on to the next section, which has a
I
little bit
kind
more
of
to
figured
it.
that would be a great opportunity to kind of introduce like Sinfioli and the concept of like the parallels and maybe even some non-parallels with like the Volsung saga, since that's going to be a running theme through all of these fragmentary texts, right? So I think that's good enough personally.
Yeah. And then from this point, we're really moving on from Zygmunt, and now we're going to be focusing mostly on Sigurd, who is his son. Um, and so, well, I guess some of that story will sort of come out as we go. But I'll read the introduction here, provided in the Larrington text. And so this is going to be concerning Gripir's prophecy, or Gripispa. It says it's clearly a late poem dependent upon the other poems which follow it in the Sigurd cycle, and possibly upon an early version of the Volsung saga. Its function is to summarize the story of Sigurd, foretelling everything which will happen to him. And so that's really the gist of it. So Sigurd is going to be talking to this guy Gripir, who's described as being incredibly wise. He has some foresight. He's able to look down the path of fate and tell Sigurd various things that are going to happen to him. And so that's really the context for what's happening here. And so it's part prophecy revealing his fate, and also there's some like wisdom literature, like Norse wisdom literature type of stuff in here, some like proverbial wisdom. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, what are some things that stood out to you?
Just a note with the relational here, but on the sixth stanza, assuming it's the this edition, but it says, "Tell me if you know," like comma uncle, as if there's like addressing him as uncle. So I'm guessing, I don't know if it said it in the introduction or not, but just like for like the listener's sake and all that,
Mhm.
this is his uncle, correct? Like that this is there is like a familial relation here of some sort.
I believe that's
Seems
even
that way.
in the end notes. They mentioned that, yeah, that Gripir that Sigurd is Gripir's sister son. And there was like a very, in Norse
Right.
societies, there was a very important relationship between a man and specifically his sister's son. I mean, we see that in Lord of the Rings with Theoden and Eowyn. Eomer,
Yeah.
and also with Eowyn as
Right.
his as both his niece and nephew, because they're his sister's children. He has a very close bond with them.
Hmm.
You know, that's a great connection. I would think I ever would have thought of that one. See, I'm just here for the on the nose stuff like Fafnir and Smog. So
Yeah.
I'm always
Yeah.
curious
Good.
in any sort of prophetic sort of literature from any culture, what sort of the relationship is between like the word of the prophet and how the word of the prophet can or cannot be undone by like the free will of the person who the prophecy who's like the main subject of the prophecy, right? Like I think of this a lot with like this like comes up all the time with like the like the dramatists of like the classical Athens period. I think like first thought would be like Tiresias, like the prophet of Apollo, and like Thebes, especially in like Oedipus Rex. There's kind of like that tension where it's like, can Oedipus like escape his fate, or is he completely, fettered to exactly what Tiresias told him? And was there any way he could have undone any of that? And I don't know how they would think of that in this culture. I don't know if any of you all have any insight to that, but that's usually like a question I always think of with these kinds of texts.
Yeah, I'm not super well read in Greek drama. Do they come down like do they unravel that tension at all in your experience?
It doesn't seem like, I mean, just thinking of like, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus specifically, I don't think of any time where they specifically like really give like a clear cut. You know how it is with like scholarship, where it's like you have like these, 2,500-year long scholarly traditions where people are debating on whether, you know, Sophocles was like a hard determinist or a compatibilist, or if he believed in like libertarian free will, or like what exactly his message was with that, right? So that's obviously like up for debate, and I don't feel qualified to give an opinion either way. That's for sure. But I'm curious how that works out in this specific culture in this text.
Yeah, in my reading, it definitely seemed like the northern cultures take a pretty hardline, fatalistic perspective of, Sigurd isn't asking what's likely to happen, what might happen. He says, what's going to happen? And then he's told, here's what's going to happen. And Sigurd says, okay. And it's like, when things, it seems like he's going to get some misfortune of various kinds, even like his death. He never goes about trying to avoid it or like questioning it. He just accepts it like, okay, this is what's going to happen. And I think that's pretty common in the Northern literature. We get the strong emphasis on like the Norns, so the fates of Norse mythology. The fact that they not only lay out the path of mortals, but they even lay out the paths of the gods, right? Even the gods are subject to fate. Which is
Right.
why Odin in a lot of these texts is constantly trying to like figure out what's going to happen because he knows it's already settled. And so I would definitely say that these Norse texts take a pretty hardline, fatalistic approach to this. And so the story is not so much about like what is Sigurd going to do. Now we know what Sigurd is going to do. We know what's going to happen at Sigurd. I guess really the question is how is he going to relate to that fate now that's presented in front of him? Is he going to play the coward and in futility try to run away, or is he just going to accept it? And I think what we find is the heroes are those who simply accept their fate and march forward, doing the things that they know they're supposed to do, even though they already know what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of two different fantasy authors. One, Tolkien, because now I'm thinking about the Children of Hurin in that light, because obviously Tolkien believes in free will, but but Turin is under the curse of Morgoth. So, like, how much free will does Turin have when we know that the author clearly believes that Turin has free will? Yet, like, Turin is always making, but it's interesting when you read The Children of Hurin, it's clearly Turin's choices that get him into trouble. Yet, it's also made clear in the story that he wouldn't be put in these situations if it weren't for the curse. So I just find that very interesting. And then
Yeah,
the other author I was thinking of in terms of what you said, Andrew, about does the hero run away from his fate or embrace it? Is Robert Jordan with the Wheel of Time, because in the Wheel of Time, the future is going to happen a certain way because it's happened that way in the past. And the hero becomes the hero by simply accepting his destiny, no matter what that is going to be. So, in different fantasy authors have tackled it in different ways.
yeah, I definitely think that I can obviously speak of Tolkien primarily on this, that he definitely makes use of this northern fate, this idea that we're going to march forward, even though like maybe we're doomed to fail. Either way, we're going to do what we're supposed to do. We're going to take the next step, even though we don't know exactly where that road's going to lead. But Tolkien, I think, I mean, he's more complicated when we're dealing with this topic because he's a Christian and
Hmm.
because he has more um, I don't know, more resources I guess to pull from regarding this relationship between fate and free will than we get simply in raw paganism. And so he brings the complexities of Christianity into the northern fatalism, and then you get the question like, what exactly is the doom of Morgoth or the curse of Morgoth or whatever we're told that is placed upon Turin? Like, what exactly is that? Is Turin actually doomed to futility, or is that his own doing? And I don't really know that. I don't know that Tolkien would be able to give us a clear answer on that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Tolkien was interested in clear answers to a lot of this stuff, which a lot of people don't get. Like for me, it always goes back to Tom Bombadil, right? There is no clear answer to what he is, yet everyone wants there to be a clear answer. And much ink has been spilled and many YouTube videos have been done trying to get a clear answer, but there is none. And you just have to sometimes with Tolkien, you just have to accept that.
Yeah, and that's because I mean Tolkien, he's not like Lewis, where Lewis usually has an idea and then he tells a story about it, whereas Tolkien tells a story and then there are all kinds of ideas that are embedded in the story, and then it just becomes a lot more ambiguous because he's not writing propaganda. Now, oh, that sounded like I'd really doing a slight against Lewis. That was not my intention.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, Lewis is obviously a lot more ideologically driven in his story creation.
Right. Yeah. He knows the kind of story he wants to tell going in. Whereas Tolkien is much more like, let me see where this goes.
Right. I mean, all the time you're reading his letters and, he's talking about how he just discovers this and that. And, when he gets to Fangorn, that's when he met the Ents for the first time. Like he didn't have this idea as to what he was going to plant here and there. He just discovered stuff, which is, not something that can really be replicated.
Yeah.
Tolkien's is more like, I have this language. Now I need to create a mythology for this language. And now, oh, I've got language and mythology, but I don't have a narrative. So now I need to create a narrative to include my mythology and my language. It's like, it's a totally different approach.
Right. I think that Tolkien is, in like the pure sense of the word, a genius. And, that sounds like I'm just a Tolkien fanboy, which I mean, fair enough, I guess. But um, that he's a genius in that you can't really teach somebody to write in the way that he went about producing his story. It just came out of him as a person. He obviously in the way that he went about writing, he didn't write as somebody who's a trained novelist doing the kinds of things that trained novelists are trained to do. It just, he read a lot of good literature. Obviously, he had his academic training. Obviously, he had his background with the sorrows of his youth, his time in the war. It's like everything that made Tolkien came out in the Legendarium, um, and um, a lot of that comes from the Northern Tales. And so, I guess back to the text here.
I was afraid to
um,
say something like might derail us a little more.
no, I mean that's fine. It's this we're not doing academic presentations here. It's all right if we get a little derailed.
I did like the structure of this particular section. I actually started to get into it. Whereas some of the earlier material in the Edda, I was just like, oh, yeah, you know, they just go and like, let's kill some guys and take their stuff, do basic Viking things. But with this, the conversation between Sigurd and his uncle and that kind of back and forth where it's like, tell me, and then he tells him, or he tries to hold stuff back. And Sigurd is like, "Come on, you've got to tell me." It was good at building that kind of tension that keeps the reader entertained and wanting to go on and read the next stanza and see how everything's going to play out. I just thought that the poet here is very effective in doing that.
Yeah, for sure. And we get just classic kind of beginning of really almost every Norse tale of you're avenging your kin. And so
Yeah.
that's where this starts off. And that's always happening in these northern tales, that so and so kills your father or whoever, and then you have to go off and do your your vengeance, and then they in turn are going to do some kind of vengeance against you. And so we get these dynastic feuds playing out here. And so he's going to go out and he's going to avenge his father, and then he's going to the next major thing is to go off and kill Fafnir. Um, Now, it's also significant that he's going to kill Fafnir with the reforged sword of his father. Um, and so we get some Narsil Underworld stuff going on here. Uh, when this is highlighted in the saga, and it's kind of referenced in the text that when in Sigmund's final battle, up to this point, Sigmund, his father, had really had the blessing of Odin upon him, which is one of the reasons why he was so successful. But as Odin tends to do, after he builds up his warrior, then he makes sure that they die in battle, so that way they go to Valhalla, and so that way they can fight for him on the day of Ragnarok. And so, after really building up Sigmund into this great warrior, this great king, he has him killed in battle by Odin himself appears as like a warrior in the midst of the battle. Sigmund goes to attack him, not really knowing who he is. In so doing, shatters his sword, which then those shards are maintained and passed on to Sigurd, who then is going to have that reforged, so then he can go off and kill Fafnir. And so we definitely get some more Tolkien connections here.
I feel like there's a story to be told by a writer more talented than me, which kind of takes the which where like takes the Odin's MO and like applies it to like the Dark Lord sort of character, because Odin is essentially harvesting people to serve as his undead army. And I'm like, that's a very Dark Lord thing to do.
Yet at the same time, Odin is seen as like, one of the best, right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting mythos that they have going on there. I guess because, I mean, death in battle itself was seen as a good thing, and so I guess it's a kind of blessing that Odin bestows upon his warriors to have them die in battle.
I'm sure
As
Odin would say that. Yeah.
yes, Odin would indeed say that. But yeah, it's kind of demented.
Yeah.
In fact, in one of the fleeting contests, I think it was Harbard's song when Odin and Thor are going at it with each other. That's
Right.
one of the things that Thor brings up, the fact that he's always like manipulating people and killing them off.
And what's funny is that Odin normally wouldn't think Thor would be that quick on the uptake to figure that out. So
Right,
sometimes Thor is smarter than Odin gives him credit for.
right. That that was, I think, one of my favorite texts so far that we've done. It's
Oh
just so
yeah, that was
crazy.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah. When I was telling a coworker that I was reading the Eddas, like that's one of the ones I used as kind of like the pitch at like you should read this, because like that was the funniest section.
yeah.
The
When
insult battle.
when I teach Beowulf on campus now, when we get to the Unferth Beowulf back and forth, now I have them read Harbard's song as well. And they always enjoy that. Now, of course, we do have Fafnir, and as Josh brought up, we get connection to Tolkien's dragons here, in that it's a wise dragon. They have conversation with each other, and so this is not just a beast.
Yeah.
And I guess we can say more about Fafnir in a little bit because he gets his own lay. Um, so
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, they even say in the last stanza, let's part and say farewell. One can't overcome fate. So the author is like, pretty clear. Okay, yep, you know, this is all set in stone.
yeah, yeah. I'd underline that as well, and so there it is. There's no point in fighting against it. Definitely a strong sense of fate there.
I think in my mind, there's always like it's like it seems like in a lot of like models of like, especially in like different like Christian theological traditions, there's usually like some kind of like mysterious relationship between like like divine sovereignty and free will. But it kind of like makes me forget sometimes that some culture, like they literally just take like a hard fatalistic, deterministic approach. It's even kind of like with like it's kind of like a different version of stoicism in a sense, right? Where it's like everything, and like all like matter is like deterministic, but like the only thing you can control is like what goes on the inside of you, right? And it's like obviously not
Mm,
quite stoicism, but it's kind of a sense where it's like, yes, everything on the outside is determined, but we can control how we we respond to it, which is kind of stoic in a sense, but
yeah.
they manifest that in a different way where it's kind of like a sense too where it's like different cultures, like most cultures, if not all cultures, or at least any like stable cultures, would believe that like cultivating virtue is a great thing. But the difference is what are those virtues that you actually cultivate, and how do you cultivate them is like what makes them different, right? And I think that's probably like what we're seeing here is almost like a different version of that in some sense, right? Like there's some connection there, I would think.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I'm like, I don't think it's an accident that in How to Train Your Dragon, the lead Viking is named Stoic.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I never thought of
Right.
that.
So there is kind of that, Vikings do seem stoical in a way, you know, even if it's not exactly the same ideology. There's that, I think that you're right, that connection of your response to things internally is what you can control. Whether you're a coward or brave or whatever, whether you face up to this or run away. It's like, but that the material sort of state of things is completely out of your hands, and that you might as well just accept what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've mentioned this before in one of our chats that I mean, there'd be some benefit in reading the Stoics, right? Reading Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or whoever alongside the Norse text, because there definitely is some commonality. There's some kinship there between the idea of like the stable, steadfast Roman warrior and the Norse warrior. Like, there's some common philosophy at play there, and what drives them, what guides them, what grounds them in their changing fortunes. So yeah, I definitely think that that's there. I have always, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days when we were up in the hills, the three of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Glome or the palace. Do you remember? The color and the smell, and looking across at the gray mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't come, and I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. And now I will make answer to you, O my judges, and show that he who has lived as a true philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he is about to die, and that after death he may hope to receive the greatest good in the other world. For I deem that the true disciple of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. They do not perceive that he is ever pursuing death and dying. And if this is true, why, having had the desire of death all his life long, should he regret the arrival of that which he has always been pursuing and desiring? The longing of Plato and the control of the Stoics pervades Lewis's retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth until we have faces. With this incredible novel, which he believed to be his best, Lewis demonstrates the tensions in ancient thought and, even more significantly, the limits of rational philosophy, which can only go as deep as the foxes can dig. Beyond that, under that, and providing the life of that thought, we find the dark and holy places that blind our faculties of reason. What then shall we do? This is a topic that we will explore after first surveying some important philosophical contributions in the ancient world that have had some significant bearing on Lewis's great novel. To this end, we will begin with Plato's Phaedo, which discusses the immortality of the soul and what those who love wisdom might expect in the life to come. And then we will spend 4 weeks with some of the great Stoics, including Epictetus, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. Finally, we will turn our attention to Till We Have Faces for the final 2 weeks with original content, and so this will not be the same as what you may have seen in the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. Each week of this 8-week study will include readings from primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that belong in your personal library. You'll be provided with recommendations for secondary readings, you'll have recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses, past, present, and future this year by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. I hope to see you there. I think there's a lot of a lot of wisdom in that. Even if as Christians, we'll maybe deepen and make this conversation a little bit more complicated, there's definitely some wisdom in just focusing on the things that you are responsible for, the things that you can control. And the vast majority of things that happen to us and around us are things that are simply outside of our control. Like, it doesn't matter, how much you maintain your health, you can still get hit by a car. Like, you can still get cancer or whatever. And so obviously our decisions matter, but the vast majority of what actually happens in our mortal lives is outside of our control. And so instead of getting spun up in anxiety about things that we were never responsible for, focus on what you are responsible for, which is how you're relating to changing fortunes around you. I think I'm starting to sound a lot like Boethius as I say that, and that's, I mean, not an accident. But so there's a lot of wisdom here, even if I think it might need a little bit more context.
Oh yeah, I definitely benefited a lot in a in a more in a rougher period of my life from reading the Stoics, and of course I've kind of moved beyond them into how Christianity builds on that. But it's like, but yeah, I think they're a good starting point, especially for it, because we live in such an age of anxiety, right? So I think that's why, even a lot of secular minded people are gravitating towards Stoicism, because I think they recognize that there's something there where it's like, I'm sick and tired of being anxious about stuff that I have no control over. So I definitely think it is a good starting point for people. I think the problem is that people kind of get stuck there and they don't, move on to other traditions which kind of build and have more of that nuance than the Stoics have.
Correct. That I think Marcus Aurelius he's a good starting place, but from there you have to go to Boethius. That's the next step.
Oh yeah.
So anything else from this text that stood out to you? There's just an interesting story which just goes into the Volsung saga that, after he kills Fafnir the dragon, which, he kills it by striking its underbelly, which to us sounds like, classic, that's how you kill a dragon, that's its weak spot, but that's because it's drawing from these foundational myths here of that this is where this came from, right? Because go back to Turin, killing the dragon, he slice its underbelly. And then he consumes its heart and its blood, which gives him wisdom, which allows him to hear the birds, which the birds tip him off that Regin, the guy who reforged his sword for him, that he doesn't have his best interests at heart here. And so then Regin gets killed as well. And then Sigurd takes the riches and he goes off. And then he falls in love with this Valkyrie, Brynhild, in this text. Although, let's see, what was her name in the Volsung saga? It's actually different.
Yeah, there appears to be some confusion as to what her name is.
Because don't they refer to her as it's like Sigurdilfa or something like that?
Something like that. Yeah, and so her name is a little confused here, but nonetheless, he falls in love with this Valkyrie, and that kind of pledges himself to her, but then later he gets bewitched and forgets about her. And so there's just this whole just confusing comedy of errors. I don't know if that's the right word, right term. Um,
I like that. Yeah.
of so and so getting with so and so, and he helps this other guy, basically his brother-in-law get together with the Valkyrie, kind of forgetting that he had a connection to her. And so it ends in just this turmoil as everything unravels, and he kind of remembers what's going on, and then he ends up getting killed. Essentially, Brynhild the Valkyrie conspires to bring about his death because he kind of refused her because at that point had been too late as everyone's sort of getting married off. And so she just kind of scorned and embittered. And so she plots for his death, which is kind of unfortunate that this is how this great man dies. But this bewitchment that befalls him that really leads ultimately to his death makes me think of the number of times we see in the Norse wisdom literature the warning against like going with witches and those who would bewitch you. Um, and I think of when you read the biblical proverbs, there's this regular warning of stay away from the prostitute, the lady of the night. Whereas in the Norse text, it's usually stay away from the witch. And so it's just kind of interesting the parallel, but also the twist there. Yeah, yeah.
Here's a thought on that because I didn't think of this until you said the word witch, but and I think of it sparked my thought on what Lewis said about this, which is an observation I've noticed in medieval literature as well. With like in the discarded image, he talks about how like people like often like associate like witch trials and stuff like that with the Middle Ages, and really that's more of like an early modern thing. So do you think like this form like of witchcraft is like unique to its time, or do you think it's just something utterly different from what we see in like the early modern period, especially even like you think like an obvious example would be like the weird sisters in like Macbeth, right? So just like a thought there because like yeah, there is kind of like a claim he makes there. I think it has a lot of validity where you actually don't really see a lot of like witches like cooking body parts in cauldrons and stuff like that out in the forest somewhere in medieval literature like it's often portrayed as sometimes in our contemporary world.
Yeah, he says similarly in Abolition of Man that you don't really see magic like witchcraft in the Middle Ages very often. That's something that's really more of a Victorian reality, or at least early modern. And yeah, I don't know. It seems to be that magic and witchcraft does play a pretty important role in the Norse culture, in that is a regular warning. And so I don't know. I don't know if this is something particularly unique to Norse culture that they have this space for witchcraft. I don't know. I don't really have a lot to comment on that.
Yeah, I wonder if it's more of like a thing in like that, or even like maybe like the Germanic traditions, whereas
Mm.
like you kind of think of like our like Anglospheric like English tradition. It's like you like the first like mythology you'd think of for the Middle Ages, or really for all of English history, that would be like the Arthurian legend, right? And like you, it's kind of like those elements are like pretty absent from that for the most part. I mean, you might see like glimpses of them here or there, but
I
yeah, I
mean,
wonder if
right.
that was like
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, you get
Arthurian
Merlin,
magic
obviously.
is yeah, Arthurian magic is more, concerned with like the Fae and
right.
even like witches like Morgan Le Fay, she's tapped into fairy rather than like, you know, what we would think of as witchcraft.
Exactly, yeah. And so yeah, I wonder if this is more like that, or if this is something that's completely of its own, or like if it's distinct in some other ways. I certainly don't have an answer. That's why I'm asking the questions and not answering them
Yeah.
myself. But there's just the thoughts running through my head right now, I guess, as you brought that up.
Yeah, just in my reading and not having any expertise here, but just in my reading so far, it seems like that there is space for kind of natural magic. I would say this would be something like fairy magic, right? That kind of reality, which seems fairly commonplace, as sometimes people will like change shape or have something that's not really seen as terribly like striking or diabolical. But at the same time, we do get this pretty regular warning against witches. don't collaborate with witches. If you see it in the road, go another direction. And so there
Hmm.
seems to be like this kind of natural fey type magic, but then there also seems to be something like diabolical that they're told you need to stay away from this. So yeah, I don't know. It seems to be a little bit of both. Which I mean, they obviously live in a very spiritual culture in that the that everything is kind of spiritually charged, which is where you get the kind of druidic type of mentality. And I guess that can be used in a positive or negative direction. I don't know. I don't have a lot of firm answers here either.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I wonder if it's tied into the natural world in some way, right? Because in a lot of ways, these types of cultures would view the natural world as almost like as a neutral thing that can either help you or harm you, depending on almost like its whim. So, like, I wonder if that's like leads to this sort of idea where it's like, yeah, there's kind of natural magic, and it can either be for your benefit or it could kill you. And again, it seems like something they don't have a whole lot of control over. It's just another thing in the world that could kill you or hex you or I remember speaking of like the medieval concepts of magic, I was reading somewhere recently that our word grammar is related to glamour. Glamour being in its origin fairy magic was called glamour. They're sort of illusionary magic to appear as different things or to confuse you. And that those two words, glamour and grammar, are etymologically connected because fairy glamour was powered by speech, words. It's why you weren't supposed to talk to fairies. Because as soon as you start talking to them, you get caught in their net of illusionary magic.
It's
Just a
interesting.
sidebar there, but yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of a line in Tolkien's On Fairy Stories where he says that, a spell is both a story told as well as like a word of power over men. So again, that idea of just like language is so attached to the world of fairy. Um, it's interesting. Um, don't really have anywhere to go from that there, but it's an interesting
Yeah,
connection.
I just think that like in this time in like this general time period of the Middle Ages, there seems to be different cross currents and ideas of what even like magic even is. Because I think that's also a very modern idea, right? That there's this thing called magic that we can very easily define as such. I don't think that HM peoples would have really looked at it that way. It's like,
Right.
oh yeah, there's magic, and that's different from the natural world or the spirit or whatever. It's like its own. I'm not sure they would have had their own category of like, oh, this is magic. You know.
Yeah, I really like some of the comments that we get on this topic from That Hideous Strength when Tolkien or Lewis rather is Lewis is talking about how things used to be a lot more ambiguous, which is why someone like Merlin kind of had his place in that he wasn't really like a demon. He was called a son of the devil, but that wasn't really accurate. He lived in kind of this ambiguous type of reality. However, the kind of magic he used to practice is no longer lawful because now things have become kind of more precise over time. Things have become less ambiguous because over time things take kind of more form, more shape. And so, what maybe used to be allowed as sort of this blending of nature and what we today would call magic, but was really just part of the natural world, that it's just kind of become disentangled over time. And not that I'm pulling anything dogmatically from that, but I think that at least on a level of, I don't know, literature, I guess, I think it's an interesting perspective.
are you sure that on the whole that novels are you sure that they're not better when there's no miracles in them?
Right. Thanks for that. Oh, who was it said that?
George Orwell.
That's right, Orwell. Orwell. That's right.
Basically, yeah, like
Yeah.
that novel was good until like, Merlin came in and all the magic stuff started happening at the end. I'm just like, no, he's dead wrong. Like, end of story, like, period, like, move on.
That was the best part.
Right.
Right. That's kind of what it's about. Yeah, that's right. Oral said like it was great until we get to all the supernatural stuff. Like that's literally the story.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Sorry that Hideous Strength is a way better dystopian novel than 1984. And end of
Correct.
story. Debate me
Correct.
online.
Yeah.
No, it's just so obviously true. I mean, it'd be easy to get off track here, but I mean, read that Hideous Strength and just look at like what's happening in the world. And Lewis was a prophet of sorts for sure.
I
Yeah.
think people have the same problem with another great Christian dystopian novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz, where the miracles happen at the end and people are just like, "What?" And I'm like, "No, that's the whole point."
Absolutely.
Well, all right. Moving on to the Lay of Regin,
Hmm.
which mostly is just like a list of like different omens. I mean, we get more of the story. I mean, I don't know that we need to get into every detail of the story here, but um, we do get a little bit more about Fafnir and his origin and the fact that he wasn't always a dragon, right? Fafnir was actually originally the brother of Regin, but essentially by hoarding this cursed gold, he ends up turning into a dragon. You know, as Lewis would tell us that sleeping on a dragon's hoard with dragonish thoughts, might actually turn you into a dragon. That's where we get Eustace Scrub turning into a dragon.
Oh, for goodness sake. Yeah, you're
So
right.
the Dragoning of Eustace is like an underrated inspiration for 20th century literature here.
I mean, yeah, and so I mean the Fafnir. I mean he's Eustace Scrub with a different ending.
No,
And he's
exactly.
Glaurung because not only is he
Mhm.
killed from underneath, but he has that whole conversation with his slayer, just like he does with Turin, although Fafnir's is much longer. I'm like, just die
Yes,
already.
and sometimes Fafnir actually like, seems to show some respect for Sigurd,
Hmm.
as opposed to Glaurung. And so he's not like just purely villainous. I mean, he is a villain. Like he turned into a dragon because he was doing dragonish things, but also he remains a level of humanity here, a level of respect for the one who is able to slay him.
Yeah,
Oh,
let
And
me
also I noticed
okay.
the magic sword, or I don't know if the sword's magic, but it's called Graham. And I'm like, oh, wasn't that a king of Rohan? Like I'm remembering the name lists. And I feel like there was a king of Rohan called Graham. So again, Tolkien is just pulling random names from the Edda and sprinkling them throughout Middle Earth, which I like. So
Yeah, he'll do that again in a little bit. One of the other texts that I noticed. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that Tolkien thinks that in Beowulf that the dragon of Beowulf was another one of these stories of a man turning into a dragon. It's kind of subtext when we're told in Beowulf that it was this lone survivor of this hoard of treasure that he buried and kind of kept all by himself. That this is the last survivor of the people that gives us the treasure, and then cut forward and there's a dragon there. And so the fact that there is some foundation here, and in fact, even in Beowulf, at one point after the slaying of Grendel, the poet in Herot connects Beowulf to the slaying of Fafnir. He references refers to him, in connection to Zygmunt because it all gets kind of confused. So even though Sigurd who killed the dragon, he connects him to Zygmunt because these tales kind of change a little bit here and there. But so there's already this connection of the dragon of the Volsung saga to Beowulf's dragon to the story, and so that's just something that Tolkien sort of supposes. Um, that's kind of interesting.
It's funny because I was gonna actually make a comment on all these like sort of like anthropomorphic dragon figures and comment how the one in Beowulf is not that way, but maybe he actually is, and it's just that when he's actually in dragon form, there doesn't seem to be like these human-esque qualities in him. But I had never heard that theory, so definitely worth looking into.
Yeah. Um, Man, it's easy to go way off track here, but I do love that scene in Beowulf where he is summoning forth the dragon. It's very Fingolfin and Morgoth, where he is directly like calling it forth, to come and meet him for battle. And so Tolkien just he's all over these northern stories. But yeah, so we get a lot of just descriptions of various omens to look out for. We don't need to necessarily go into all that. I do think it's interesting that the Norse treat the sun as feminine. Um,
Oh,
yeah, in
really?
stanza 23, there's a reference to the sun as the shining sister of the moon. And so in the Northern mythos, a lot of times they'll refer to, actually, every time they refer to the sun with the feminine and the moon masculine, which is just kind of interesting to me. I'm not exactly sure how they get there because, I mean, naturally, our way of thinking of the sun as masculine and moon as feminine, that makes like some rational sense to me. So I don't really know how the Norse got to this position, but it's just interesting difference, which, I mean, this is what Tolkien does in the Silmarillion.
Yep. Yep. And even in the Lord of the Rings, the hobbits always call the sun she.
Right. Whereas, read Tolkien's or Lewis's Ransom series, and the sun is masculine and the moon is feminine.
I was about to say that's like, Sol and Luna and like the Roman mythos, right? It's totally reversed.
Right. It's interesting. Yeah. And then in stanza 25, right toward the end here, it says, "Combed and washed every thoughtful man should be, and fed in the morning, for one cannot foresee where one will be by evening. It is bad to rush headlong before an omen." So there's always talk about omens, which are definitely tied to this theme of fate that we've been discussing. That an omen is properly perceived brings awareness to something that's going to happen, and so there's this
Hmm.
fatalism. But also, we're told that like you just do the stuff that you need to do, like get dressed for the day and go out and meet fate. Don't just wait for it to come to you.
And that reminds me too of I was listening to a podcast once. This is another Roman connection where they were saying how the Romans were very obsessed with omens, but almost kind of retroactively, where a big, earth-shattering political event would happen, and then they would search back in the weeks and months previous to try and find all of these natural omens that would have forecast it in hindsight. And so, like in Roman histories, like Suetonius and stuff, he'll talk about somebody's assassination, but then also list all of these omens that supposedly predicted it before it happened or were supposed to clue us in. So again, maybe the Romans were always in conflict with the Germanics because they had more in common than either of them would like to let on.
Right. They don't want to admit their commonality with the barbarians. Well, unless there's anything else there, I mean, looking over to the Lay of Fafnir, and we've kind of been talking around some of the different story elements, but I mean, this is more about Fafnir. But this is mostly about the conversation between Fafnir and Sigurd, following the mortal blow to Fafnir. And Fafnir recognizes the fact that like this gold is going to play a part in his undoing, in Sigurd's undoing. He says those rings, like this treasure that you're liberating from me right now. He says that those rings will be your death. And so there's this strong sense that this is cursed gold, and that that seizing a dragon's hoard is not necessarily the right virtuous course of action. And Fafnir, if anybody, would understand the consequences of latching yourself onto gold. And so he's even trying to give a kind of warning to Sigurd, although, of course, in the movement of fate, it's not going to do anything.
Here's something I thought of, but contrasting again the difference of like with Beowulf there being like the epic dragon fight, and then with Sigurd's approach to his dragon, it's more the approach is more about um like cunning, a cunning ability and wit than it is like direct valor and combat. And I can't help but see this connection with like, Achilles and the valor and combat in the Iliad, and then Odysseus kind of getting his way back to Ithaca um through wit, right? Rather than through being cunning in this sense, rather than through more like brawn and valor, and in the way that Achilles approached it in the Iliad, kind of contrasting those two characters and seeing almost like those parallels in this tradition. I couldn't help but notice that when I was reading that introductory paragraph or two to this poem.
Yeah, yeah. There's really not a great like huge fight, like epic fight between Sigurd and Fafnir. It goes pretty quickly. It's more about the discourse than the actual combat.
Yeah, it's almost like it is like Odysseus blinding the Cyclops, isn't it? It's quick and
Mhm.
then it's over, you know?
It's like almost like he doesn't need to be strong and need to be able to go, blow with blow for with Hector in a sense, even like the other greatest warrior in the fight, right? Because he can just figure out a way to deal with it quickly once he's figured it out in a sense.
Yeah, in later on in this lay, Sigurd says to Regin, "Courage is better than the power of a sword when where angry men have to fight. For I've seen a brave man fighting strongly conquer with a blunt sword. So courage is more important than the weapon that you're wielding, even though he has an important weapon. Like that's not really the point. His courage is primary here."
I'm also interested by this, and the text mentions it several times, that Fafnir has something called a helm of terror. And if you look in the end notes, it says we're not really sure what that was. Was it an actual helm or is this like a metaphor? And I find that interesting.
But I do think that regardless of what this was in the story, this is where we get Turin's helm.
Oh, the dragon
Mm.
helm. You're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm missing some of these connections. Sounds like I'm due for a reread on some of these non-Lord of the Rings Tolkien tales.
Yeah, I know we talked about maybe doing Children of Hurin for the next patron chats. Maybe we'll see, but
Oh,
that
nice.
might
Yeah.
be a good follow up to this set.
It
It would be.
might be, yeah, because it's so infused with that Norse
Mhm.
spirit. I think of all the things, of all the first age stuff, it might be the most
Yeah,
Norse.
and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Anything else stood out to you here?
Hmm.
I do just have to point out the stanza 14 referring to blood as sword liquid. I need to find a way to incorporate that into my vocabulary. It
That
was
is a
like
good
I
one.
can't remember which one it was in, but it was one of like the first poems in this entire book. Like they refer to like a beard as like a cheek forest, and I'm just like these
Yes.
are terms that like I need to start using these on people and just see how they react.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. There's a lot of great phraseology in these texts.
Oh, I like how the text can't decide whether Regan is a dwarf or a giant. And that kind of, again, it's that Norse ambiguity about what some of these things even are. Like where sometimes the dwarves and the giants are used interchangeably. Elves are never explained at all in any detail. And
Say what even was a dwarf in the Eddas, because like ever since
right.
Tolkien, it's like we have Tolkien dwarfs, and now Tolkien dwarfs are just every dwarf that's ever existed since Tolkien, right? They all just like look like the dwarfs in The Hobbit and Gimli, right? But before that, it's like what exactly was a dwarf in like the 13th century, right?
I mean, my understanding is that, I mean, something like Tolkien's dwarves, at least in stature, in that they seem to be smaller for the most part. They seem to be into smithing, that sort of thing. However, um, usually they're either evil or at the very least, like you can't really trust them. Like they're kind of wily, and so they're not really good characters. In fact, in Tolkien's first imagining of the dwarves, they were going to be villains, like inherently. Like kind of like the same caliber as like the orcs and that like these are just bad people. Obviously he reworked that, but yeah, and so they seem to be these like little crafty troublemakers.
I wonder if like him like making the dwarfs good was like the first time in like, you know, the literary tradition that dwarfs were actually like not bad in a sense. So it's like maybe him flipping the
Mm.
script just kind of has changed it for the past 70 or 80 years or so.
He mentions in one of the letters that his dwarves take more really from the brothers Grimm dwarves than the Norse. So
Hmm.
like the Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, where they're basically good characters. And so he seems to have like just merged the two, I guess, traditions that there were, and out pops what seems like a completely new thing.
It would be interesting to study the history of dwarves. I mean,
Yeah.
to like how do we get to the Brothers Grimm dwarves, from the
Right.
original
Yeah.
version? Like that'd be interesting to study sometime. Would be one of my side projects.
Say the things I would study if this was my day job.
Exactly.
Oh,
Right. Yeah.
somebody
Yeah,
please fund me. Like,
if I ever get to a point where I'm just fully funded independently, that's the kind of stuff I'm going to do with my life.
Oh yeah, believe me. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I was doing that this morning where I was outlining like my dream book of like do of researching some of this stuff, and I'm like, I'm never going to write this because I don't have the time, or like I'm not independently funded. But it's like, and I was
Yeah.
thinking about the stack of books I would need to write this one book, and I'm like, mm,
See, a lot of times I get this impulse of, okay, here's what I want to write because it's what I want to read, right? It's that Tolkienian impulse. But then I
yep,
realize I feel like only I would want to read this.
yeah. Mhm.
And that
Yeah,
kind of kills
that
it.
was one of those. That was one of those cases for me. It's like I think only I would want to read this. Yeah. Oh, and the sidetrack, the birds. That seemed like straight out of The Hobbit, almost, where like they talk like the thrush, where he talks to
Hmm.
Bard and exposes the weak point, because it's the same thing, right? They're warning Sigurd of some danger, with what's his name, Regin, right? So yeah,
Hmm.
but they weren't thrushes though. They were some other kind of bird.
Who were they? I don't remember.
Nuthatches. That's it. Yeah, nuthatches.
And I don't really know what a nuthatch is.
No, I don't think I've ever seen one.
I don't know. And so I guess birds are connected to wisdom. I mean, I know, Odin has his ravens, who
Mm.
go throughout the earth and then report back to him. And so I guess birds do have this connection to wisdom, and consuming the dragon heart gives you this access to the same wavelength essentially, so you can understand what they're saying. Um, Interesting.
That was another thing where I was like, oh, that's where that comes from. Because I've seen
Hmm.
that referenced in other things where you eat the dragon's heart and you can understand all languages. And I'm like, oh, it's
Hmm.
from this originally.
Right.
So much dragon lore comes from the
Hmm.
Eddas.
Yeah, and can't remember who his commentary on Beowulf or maybe Monsters and the Critics, but Tolkien says that, a lot of times we think that looking back that, dragons were all over the place in the old stories, but they're really not. There are only like a few major examples of dragons in the old literature. And Fafnir is one of the primary dragons of Germanic lore. And so the fact that there actually weren't a lot of dragons in their imagination means that this story is going to be very significant for a lot of the dragon lore that comes out of it.
That's so true because, like, I think last year or the year before, I did a deep dive into dragon lore, and you're so right. Like, it's far less common than you'd think
Hmm.
it was. And then once a pattern gets established in dragon lore, every subsequent dragon uses it.
Right.
In the Saint hagiographies, almost all the dragons are identical and do the same kinds of things. Like
Hmm.
it that was very, very interesting to me because I thought I would. because I was specifically trying to find as many stories as I could of saints with dragons. And I thought they would all be interesting and different and varied, but no, they were almost the stories had the same beats, and the dragons themselves all had very much the same details.
Well,
But
obviously that tells us that's how dragons were, and that's what saints were like. So, now, I mean, one last Tolkien connection at this point. I mean, there's a reference to the importance of rings. In fact, even the birds reference Sigurd as like someone who gives away rings. And so this gets to the Germanic culture of, the great leaders get gold. They'll, break up the rings of their foes, and then they'll basically turn them into other rings, and then they give out to those who do service to them, which definitely feeds right into the idea of Sauron as the ring lord. He's a giver of rings. Obviously he's a perverted form of the ideal ring lord, but nonetheless that imagery comes directly from these texts.
Is anybody else like growing up on like Tolkien and stuff, like just whenever you started reading historical like ancient medieval text, do you just like see like the word ring and you're instantly looking for a connection to Tolkien? I was like the first time I read the Republic and like the Ring of Gygax, I'm like, okay, like how's this gonna relate? Like I'm always looking for those connections, and sometimes they're probably there and I miss them, and sometimes they're probably just not there, but sometimes they are.
Even when it comes to Tolkien, it's all in Plato.
Are they teaching in these schools?
Exactly. Well, um, yeah, unless there's anything else, can go ahead and move on. All right, we got the Lay of Sigrdrifa. I'm sure I just butchered that terribly. Um,
That was the
but
name, though. That's the Brynhild name in this text, which threw me off for a
yes,
second.
yes. And so this is Brynhild. Brynhild as she should have been.
Right.
Let's glance through here. Oh, here's another Tolkien name poll. There's a reference to meme here, MIM, such as with the petty dwarf of Children of Hurin.
yes, yeah. Oh, and the warriors are often referred to as trees in these texts. I don't know if you guys picked up on that. Or like
Well,
the apple tree of battle at one point someone is called. And I think at some point somebody's called a beech tree or something like that. So that seems to be a recurring theme, warrior as tree. And I'm wondering what the symbol like what they're picking up on. Because you wouldn't have that metaphor if there wasn't something tree-like about a warrior. So I wonder what they're I'm missing some context here that they're picking up
I
on.
mean,
Yes.
I guess you got the indomitable strength of nature, the steadfastness. Um, yeah, I mean, other than just like strength, being steadfast, I'm not quite sure.
I was going to say it's as simple as like just like the rigidness and sturdiness as well, like equating to like fortitude in some way, or I don't know. It's probably something far beyond that, but
I wonder if
obvious
I
ones.
wonder if that language and uh, we can't help but to constantly reference Tolkien and studying these texts. But when Tolkien says that he had this image in his head of okay, what if the trees went to battle, right? This is where we get the version of the Ents as he tries to improve on Shakespeare as he essentially put it. Um, but a lot of this text is really just going through runic wisdom of you need this rune in
Yeah.
order to do this thing. So it's a long list of that.
I would say there's really like there's kind of like these like runic stanzas. What is that like 5 through 18, where it's kind of like just listing like these different runes that represent these different things that he must have in a sense, and that like it doesn't really actually kind of like go back into like the frame of like the I guess like the plot of this poem until like stanza 21. But yeah, you have like what like I think like 5 through 18 there. It's kind of like deviates a little bit to go into that.
Yeah, and even then in 21 where it shifts a little bit, okay, we get this Northern Courage statement here where it says, I will not flee even if you know I am doomed. I was not born a coward. And so this idea of I'm going to march into my doom because, well, being a coward is worse. And so it doesn't really matter what lays in front of me. I'm going to keep marching forward. And there's very similar lines to that all throughout Tolkien. But then, move forward, and the rest of this text is largely like proverbial wisdom now. And so a lot of this is like wisdom literature.
It also like that reminds me, and this line is not from Tolkien himself, it's from the movies, but it's very Norse in a way when Gimli says, "Certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for?"
Yeah, it's a obviously comical approach at this very northern idea.
Hmm.
Like in stanza 23, how it's like it's kind of has like biblical language almost in a sense, kind of like in the Sermon on the Mount or in like I think it's like James 5, but where it talks about um, do not swear an oath unless it is truly kept. Terrible fate bonds attached to the oath tear. Like just like this value of like basically like, hey, like don't make an oath unless you're actually going to keep it. And also therefore there are these deep, maybe even mortal consequences to the oath breaker in a sense for not keeping it. Like they take oaths really seriously, right? And like we certainly see that in like biblical language in the New Testament as well.
Also, Dunharrow. This is the army of the dead, right? Terrible fate bonds attached to the oath terror. Wretched is the pledge criminal. They broke their oath, therefore they're, condemned to undeath until they fulfill it.
Hmm.
That all comes full circle.
It's all in Tolkien.
Say Tolkien, Jesus, Edda, like it's all there. Like,
Yeah, but that does definitely tie into just this resolute, really kind of stoic idea of there's this direct connection between like your words and your steadfast soul. And so your oaths matter. You need to do what you say that you're going to do. And so that's a continual idea here. And so, as much as, when you read some of the early wisdom literature that we looked at, like the Havamal, and sometimes the proverbs that they're given, seem well, not very virtuous to us looking back. Like there is still a degree of virtue that I think is that we would see as virtue even in the Norse wisdom literature here. Like in there's oath keeping in stanza 32. It says, I advise you that you guard against evil and distance yourself from light-mindedness. Do not entice girls or any man's wife, nor encourage excessive pleasure. And so this idea that like you don't don't commit adultery, keep yourself from evil. And so
Right.
some of this wisdom could easily just be pulled from Proverbs as well.
I was going to say that sounded straight out of Proverbs almost. Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, and the next stanza, it talks about you should bury the dead,
Hmm.
which is interesting because I thought the Norse normally burned their dead. Yet it says here that I advise you, ninthly, that you bury corpses where you find them on the ground, whether they are dead of sickness or else drowned or men killed by weapons.
So
Hmm.
I wonder if just burying is what you do if you just like happen upon a body, but then you maybe do the ceremony if it's for like somebody that you need to honor.
Yeah.
It's my guess. I don't really know. Um, Again, there's a warning in here about staying away from witches in stanza 26.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a humorous one almost. It's like that I advise you, fourthly, if a witch full of malice lies on your rote, better to go on than be her guest, though night overtake you. You know, that was in other words, like even if it's dark, don't stay at a witch's house. Keep walking.
You can see how that plays into some of even like the grim fairy tales.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Don't go to the witch's house in the woods.
Yep,
And
and there's a
then
lot here
yeah.
about quarreling,
Hmm.
like don't quarrel over ale, over women, very practical advice for back then.
Yeah, and then toward the end in 36, he says, quarrels and enmity, don't think they've gone to sleep any more than grief. Common sense and weapons are necessary for the prince to acquire, for him who shall be foremost among men. So, don't think that just because you seem to have dealt with this argument, this disagreement, that it's over. You need to make sure that you have some weapons on your side. All right. Anything else anyone wants to bring up for that text? Okay, then rolling on to a fragment of a poem about Sigurd.
I think I mean, that first stanza, I kind of read that almost like obviously that's a question that belongs within the narrative of the text, but it almost seems like a question that could be um like directed to the reader as like a reflection for going into the rest of the text as well. Like it's like what has Sigurd done so wrong that you want to deprive the brave man of life? And I just think that's kind of like a profound introductory kind of it's like an
Hmm.
introductory like provoking question to the text, and even like thinking some way it's like I'm thinking almost in like platonic terms in a sense here, but it's like I almost instantly like start thinking about like justice, and it's like is there some way in which like Sigurd dying is just, or is this complete injustice, and was he not deserving of it in any way? That's those are kind of like the questions that begun to come to mind for me with this.
Yeah, and a lot of this, as we read about the death of Sigurd, I mean, in the kind of meta level of this narrative, it goes back to Fafnir's warnings that taking the treasure is going to be his doom, or it's going to lead to his doom. Because it's part of the like, attention that he gets from this great victory and taking the treasure away is that he enters into this relationship with Brynhild, which eventually is going to end up leading to his death, right? She's the one who's going to conspire his death through this entire series of mishaps and bewitchments and whatnot. But going back to taking the treasure hoard from Fafnir, like that can be seen as really a starting place of the end. And it says at the end, the epilogue, that there's different versions as to like exactly where and how Ziggurar died, but what they all have in common is that he died when he was lying down and unarmed. So he didn't get to die really a hero's death. He just died as a result of a plot, which I suppose continues kind of the connection to at least the sort of the aesthetics of Children of Hurin, in that Turin doesn't die in battle, right? He kills himself, and I feel like it has the same kind of feeling as you get to the end, in that you follow the story of this great hero who's done some incredible things, some great feats of strength, but in the end he dies a kind of pitiful, sad death.
Right. It's almost like
Spoilers.
if, yeah, spoilers. It's almost if like Turin had, if he had died, fighting the dragon, that would have been a much more classically
Right.
heroic way for him to go out, no matter what had transpired. But it has to be a full, literally to the hilt tragedy.
Right. He's falls on his suddenly talking sword.
You joke about spoilers, but I have friends that I'm going to send this video to when it's published that I believe haven't read Children of Hurin, so maybe I'll just tell them to stop at like a certain timestamp or something. That's
Yeah,
all.
then again, it's entirely fitting with the Northern stories to know the ending before it happens, right? So it's fate.
There's also a sense too with that where even like slight like side thing here, but like yes, like obviously like you want to be surprised and see like the plot unfold for the first time and experience that
Yeah.
spoiler free, but there's a sense where like our culture builds everything on like gotcha moments. It's just about like stuff happening in the plot where it's like this is why like people like I don't want to get on a soapbox and preach too much here, but this is like why like people like just they read a bunch of like just different contemporary books like one time and they like don't understand why people would reread books. And it's like no, like what makes a great book is the fact that like people for hundreds or thousands of years have reread it because it's so rich that you can reread it over and over and over again, like every year of your life, maybe even, and never comprehend some things in it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what Lewis says. I mean, very much drawing on his Platonism when he says that a good story is not based around becoming, but on being, on like states of being. And that the more that you reread good stories, the more you're going to move closer and closer to the ideals that are represented within the stories. And that is itself the story. This is the further up and further in idea that we get at the end of Narnia, that it's, we're going into the real Narnia within Narnia. And so I think that is absolutely true, that a good story is one that you're going to be compelled to read again and again and again, and gets better the more that you're familiar with it.
Right, yeah, because you start to look forward to those beats and those moments where it's like, yeah, it's not like experiencing the first time, but it's almost kind of better in a way when you know it's coming. It's very strange, but it's something I've definitely experienced as I reread my favorite texts, where it's like you almost start to live in the text in a way.
Hmm.
It's very and experience it as almost like a participant and not a spectator. It's very strange experience. Like I don't think I'm explaining it well, but yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah, it's the idea of like enchantment or entering the perilous realm. It's like it becomes, or it awakens something inside of you the more connected you are to it. And so that discovery is, I mean, it's part of the experience, and it only grows the more that you grow with the text. Um, you know, Aslan seems larger as you grow larger. Well, so now last text for this section, short little text, the poem of Gudrun, who, let's see, who was Gudrun again? Okay, Gudrun, that was the wife of Sigurd.
Mm.
And so Gunnar is if I'm recalling correctly, Gunnar is the brother of Gudrun, and Gunnar is the one who actually killed Sigurd, I believe. Um, and so Gudrun now is she is lamenting. Well, actually, at first she can't really lament. Like she isn't responding really at all until finally somebody has the wisdom to basically show her the body of Sigurd, to unveil the body of Sigurd, and that allows her to connect to the reality of what took place. So now she's able to actually lament, and then also she starts to pronounce doom on Gunnar for what he's done. And he says, you won't get the good of the gold. The rings will be the death of you, for you swore oath to Sigurd. So she accuses him of being an oath breaker and says that basically this gold is going to be your doom, even as we're told that the gold is going to be the doom of Sigurd himself. So there's this idea of history repeating itself. We definitely see some precedents for Tolkien's tendency to have a lot of very similarly sounding names.
Oh yes, yeah. On the Secrets of Middle Earth podcast, we joke about that all the time, where it's either everybody's name starts with F or everybody's name starts with C. And so in the
Right.
Silmarillion, yeah. Oh, I like stanza 19 where Gudrun's referring to herself, I believe. She says, "I am as little as a leaf among the bay willows. Now the prince is dead." I thought that was very beautiful.
Hmm.
She feels like almost viscerally feels her littleness in the face of the death of her husband.
Yeah, and then contrasting that with the beginning of that stanza, where it says, I seemed also among the prince's warriors to be higher than any of Odin's ladies. So he says, like, when I was with you, I was like better than the Valkyries, and now
Hmm.
I'm less than nothing. Yeah, this whole section, I mean, it's I don't have a lot to like comment on other than just I mean, it's just so like such a visceral, impassioned lament. It's just kind of beautiful and heartbreaking.
Yeah, and just very complex, like psychologically complex too, as you mentioned. She almost can't even grieve in the beginning because, and like it's like you said, someone has the wisdom to show her the body, which almost unleashes that kind of torrent of, she's finally able to almost process in a way.
Right. Right.
Or that's almost like that first like stage of denial, and then like the seeing of the body almost invokes you know the sensory in a sense, where like she can't deny like what she actually sees and witnesses, and that like that image of death is what actually brings about and provokes the like finally provokes the lamentations in a sense.
Right. I mean, the right kind of lamentation is itself grounding. It connects you to the reality of what you're experiencing. And so, she had to come to terms with this reality in order to properly connect herself with the world because, it's so easy to do in the midst of sorrow. She's kind of disengaged, which, as you said, is something like denial. It's a escape without hope of recovery.
Right. And it's like that recognition that like, no, death is wrong. This shouldn't be. Like, the world is broken somehow, like
Right.
this shouldn't happen. And yet, like it does, whereas nowadays our culture just flees from that idea of having to deal with it, you know. If we can ignore it, we don't have to deal with it. We don't have to see it. We don't have to grapple with the reality that A, death is real, and B, we almost know it shouldn't be like this, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I'm content with that being the ending words, unless Josh or Thomas, do you have anything else that you want to feel compelled to add? I know we've been going on for a little while now. Um, all right. Well, I enjoyed this chat. After taking a month off, it's good to get back into it. We'll see what next month looks like with you know, we're with our next one coming soon. I know Josh's is coming soon as well, and so we'll see where things look. But hopefully we'll be able to get another one out next month with whoever's able to attend. But for now, appreciate you guys stopping by, and we'll do it again next time. All right. Well, that's it for now. And so thank you for listening. And remember to go to patreon.com/Mythic Mind to join the fellowship. And I should say that my wife and I are expecting our next kid really any day now. And so I'm trying to build up a little bit of content to sort of spread that across the coming weeks. However, if there is a little bit of a break, no, that's probably why. All right. Well, that's it for now. And until next time, Godspeed. When you go to the roots of the word philosophy, you find the love of wisdom, which unfortunately is not what you find at the roots of all who call themselves philosophers. Now, how do we get here? What are the ideas that shape our world, and what can the old world tell us in response to the perennial questions of what it means to be human, what is our purpose, and what, if anything, ought we aspire to? In a brief history of ideas, we will navigate major epics of thought and survey some of the most important figures in the Western canon, including Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Descartes, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Kierkegaard. And of course, we will consider even more names, but these are the thinkers that will supply our primary readings. Each week will include primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that do belong in your personal library. You'll be recommended some secondary texts, you'll be provided with some recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. I've been teaching philosophy for many years, and I can say with confidence that you will leave this 6-week course with a better understanding of the foundations of Western thought than most contemporary philosophy majors. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses, past, present, and any course that begins during the term of your subscription by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. So again, purchase a Tier 3 annual subscription, and I'll give you a special code that gives you access to all courses that either have taken place or do start in this term. And I sincerely hope to see you there.